Hello and welcome to the Electronics Watch webinar, Social Responsible Public Procurement Extending to Extractives in the Electronics Industry. We at Electronics Watch are very happy to be able to provide our affiliates and also other public buyers and interested parties with insights on a diverse set of topics relating to both public procurement as well as the ICT industry through our webinar series. The current webinar is the second webinar in our series, and we already plan for the third one, which will be on May 29th, and I will talk about it briefly at the end of this webinar. As you may know, Electronics Watch is partnering with 10 other organizations in the Make ICT Fair project. One of the main aims of this EU-funded project is to look into how to remedy the human rights violations in the mining sector of the ICT supply chains. ICT devices contain precious minerals such as lithium, gold, copper, and cobalt, and the extraction of these minerals has severe impacts on workers, communities, and the ecosystems surrounding many sites. Social responsible public procurement can be one way to start a positive change. A first step to this process is to better understand what is happening in the extractive sector and to get insights into the public buyer's perspective on this. This is why we are happy and very happy to welcome Irene Schipper from SOMO and Liz Cooper from the University of Edinburgh as experts to our webinar. Irene Schipper, who is working at the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations, SOMO, in Amsterdam, specializes in corporate structures and supply chains and cases of corporate misconduct. She conducts research on electronic supply chains, the extractive industry, and the pharmaceutical sector. Irene has done research on mining of mica, as well as artisanal gold mining in countries such as Mali. Irene will give us insights into the importance of the extractive industry in the ICT supply chain and existing regulatory initiatives. Irene was preparing this webinar with Esther Dehaan, also from SOMO, and Irene will take the lead on presenting the results of their work. Liz Cooper is the Research and Policy Manager of the Department of Social Responsibility and Sustainability at the University of Edinburgh. Liz manages there a program of work on fairness in trade and sustainable procurement, working closely with the procurement office, academics, students, and external partners. The university has been a member of Electronics Watch since 2014 and has policy commitments on fair trade, conflict minerals, and modern slavery. Liz will present on the conflict minerals policy at the University of Edinburgh. Before I hand over to Irene, a brief note on logistics. We would like to start the discussion after both presentations are finished. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, but we would ask you to write the questions directly to Martina through the chat window. Martina will then, at the end, relay your questions to our experts. So thank you from my side, and now I hand over to Irene.
Okay, so you all see the first slide, right? So thank you, Peter, for the introduction. So basically I can skip this slide. So SOMO, we have worked in, Esther and I, in many projects on the electronics supply chain, such as Make IT Fair, Procure IT Fair, and the Good Electronics Network. And as you said, we have expertise on research on gold, cobalt, the platinum group metals, coltan, recently mica, and now also working on lithium. So in this presentation, I would like to address 4 questions. So why are the electronic brands being held responsible for the mining of minerals? So it actually addresses why it is important for public procurers to include the extractive phase in sustainable procurement standards, and what are currently the most relevant frameworks for electronic brands regarding responsible mining of minerals. So this includes soft law and hard law. So I want to show some of the current initiatives on responsible mining. And I would like to share some of SOMO's recommendations towards electronic brands, what they should do for responsible mining practices. So it's not exhaustive, but I think some of these recommendations are also interested for public procurers to look at them to see if they are if they can use them too. So why is it important to hold electronics brands responsible for the mining of minerals? And basically, the most simple answer is supply chain responsibility, which is the core of CSR. And supply chain responsibility is also central in some of the leading international CSR standards, such as the OECD guidelines, the UN Global Compact, and the UN Guiding Principles. But it's also in industry codes and company codes and certifications. So basically, a definition of supply chain responsibility is that it implies that a company does all it can to enable, promote, and implement responsible business practices throughout its supply chain. And for this, it's important not to only to focus on the production part of the supply chain, but to extend it to the extraction phase, the consumption phase, and disposal. So that is how SOMO works in its projects on supply chain responsibility in the electronic sector. So disposal is also really important to include, because basically then you can recycle minerals and you can diminish the pressure on the extraction phase. The extraction phase, companies that use minerals in products, they actually risk contributing to conflict financing, human rights violations, and the issues at this level of the electronic supply chain are include such severe issues like let's say human rights violations, the worst forms of child labor, forced labor, contributing to conflicts, land grabbing, forced evictions, environmental degradations. So the severity of those violations make it of utmost importance also to include it in sustainable procurement initiatives. And why SOMO also focuses for a long time already on the electronics industry related to minerals is that these companies, they do have leverage. So in all our research, we looked at how important they are in the global demand of certain minerals. So you can say it's only 2 grams of tin in each phone, but in the end, 50% of the global market, tin market, is for solder. And the same goes for gold. It's only 0.1 gram of gold in each phone, but in the end, it's 7.5% of the global gold demand that is used by the electronic sector. And for some other minerals, it's even more, like it's 40% of the cobalt, it's 25% of the global mica demand. So that makes that electronics brands do have leverage over their mineral supply chain. So actually, SOMO already started in 2007 with several publications, which were Make IT Fair publications on minerals, addressing the electronic sector. So it was about platinum, tin, tantalum, and cobalt. And it was actually for the first time addressing the responsibility for violations at the mining level in the electronic supply chain. And we must say that the electronics companies thought it was outrageous to hold them responsible of violations at the mining level. And because they were just starting in 2004 with the Electronics Industry Code of Conduct and implementing the Code of Conduct at the first tier in their supply chain. So they were really focusing on that level, and they thought it's outrageous to be responsible for things that are happening up to 7 tiers away from themselves. They said, we do not source ourselves these minerals. And we only use small volumes per product and per company. And basically, they did their own research also in 2007, and they acknowledged the fact they are the main users of some of the minerals, and they do have leverage over it. So that was a good first step. But nowadays, in discussions with the electronic sector, it is a returning discussion, actually, that they say, okay, it's so far away down the supply chain, we do not source it ourselves. We have small volumes and we have capacity problems because there are so many minerals with grave impacts. So on which minerals should we focus? To show a bit about the complexity of a mineral supply chain, this is an example of a gold supply chain. So this is a route from Ghana. So you see at the left, it starts with an artisanal mining site in Ghana. It's our illegal mines, and child labor is one of the main issues at this mining site. Then you see that locally you have, it goes to local traders. Sometimes it's like 3 levels of local traders in a country. In this overview, you see, okay, one local trader with a license, then it goes to local exporters. So 2 names of companies of exporters are mentioned here, PCCM and Azan SKA. They are actually exporting it to Switzerland, to a gold refiner, Metalor. And I think it's important to mention that in the gold supply chain, the refiners are the crucial in the supply chain. The total market of the refineries, there are 6 main players, 6 main gold refiners. They actually refine about 90% of the total gold. So you see a concentration of companies there. They are handling most of the gold that is used by the electronic sector. From that point, from the refiners, it goes to other countries, importers, and they are making the semi-finished products. Then it goes to component manufacturers. From the component manufacturers, it goes to the contract manufacturers, assembling the final product. And only then you come at the level of the electronics brands like Apple, Intel, Philips. So if a company says we are at least 7 tiers away from where it happens, this overview shows actually indeed it is about 6-7 levels away. This graphic was based on a Human Rights Watch report. I think it's important to look at the most relevant frameworks for supply chain responsibility. Clearly, at the moment, the most relevant frameworks are the UNGP, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Supply Chains of Minerals for conflict-affected and high-risk areas. That are the main frameworks, and they indicate what is expected from companies, at a minimum, I would say. In the UN Guiding Principles, there are different responsibility scenarios. And if you're talking about electronics brands and violations at the mining level, we are talking about the third scenario. So these electronic brands are being directly linked to an adverse impact. It's important to know which scenario you are talking about, because also different responsibilities or different expectations are connected to it, what companies should do. So if a company is directly linked to an adverse impact through its supply chain, then the UN Guiding Principle says the company should use its leverage to prevent or mitigate impact of the third party causing the impact. So that is the responsibility of the company. In the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals, I'm a bit distracted by the typing, but sorry. So this is actually a roadmap to help companies to avoid contributing to conflict through the mineral purchasing practices. It's a guidance how to conduct risk-based supply chain due diligence. It has supplements on the conflict minerals, the 3TG, tungsten, tin, tantalum, and gold. But recently, in 2017, also a practical guide is published to identify and address the worst forms of child labor in mineral supply chains. So you can use that broader than 3TG and broader than only focusing on the DRC and adjoining countries. Of course, there are also the codes of conduct and binding regulations. I think I was missing a slide. No.
Also, Irene, can I just let you know that you've got about 5 minutes?
5 minutes. Okay, I speed up. Yeah. Yeah. So if we are looking at the binding regulations, which is really important, it was regarding to responsible mining. So you have the Dodd-Frank Act that focuses on conflict minerals from the DRC and adjoining countries. That includes a disclosure requirement for US listed companies to report on their use of the conflict minerals. If they are using conflict minerals, they have to report about their due diligence efforts. And you can find all this information in the conflict minerals report, which includes lists of identified smelters. And so far, our findings with this reporting, or findings of CSOs, that this public reporting is a crucial mechanism. And what is currently lacking is that there are no details about the encountered risks or how they are addressed. So transparency is key. It's good that there are this information is out there, but it's not enough yet. Of course, there's also now the EU conflict minerals regulations. It also only focuses on the 3TG, but the potential geographical scope is the world, so it's widened up. The scope of companies is more limited. It's only addressing the importers. So basically only the companies that are importing conflict minerals into Europe to use it in their manufacturing, they are obliged to comply with this regulation. But it's not if you are only selling electronics, you are not covered by this legislation. So some of the obligations are that importers have to indicate the source of origin, provide names and addresses of suppliers. If it's from conflict areas, then they also should have to name the mine where the minerals and where the minerals were consolidated, traded and processed. Yeah, and it's the idea that the European Commission will create a so-called white list of global smelters and refiners which source responsibly to help manufacturers, but also public procurers. Yeah, there are several initiatives nowadays that cover responsible mining. Some focus on specifically on conflict minerals, the 4 conflict minerals, 3TG. So really important in this respect is the conflict-free smelter program, which is now called the Responsible Mining Initiative. This is the initiative that basically all the electronics companies are using, but I must say it's also a bit of a checkbox opportunity for companies. It's easy to join this initiative and to comply with the Dodd-Frank Act, basically. So there are other initiatives that are mentioned here. I will not go into it. There are also initiatives that is focusing on one specific conflict mineral. Here I give some examples related to gold. And these initiatives are focused on sourcing conflict-free gold. What is important to mention is that there are some initiatives that go beyond conflict minerals. For instance, the Responsible Mica Initiative, the Responsible Cobalt Initiative, that's a Chinese initiative. There is the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative that also have various projects, including cobalt, tin mining. There's this Fair Trade and Fair Mine Standard and the Gold Covenant, also called the Agreement of Responsible Gold. So that are various initiatives that are currently out there. I was saying I would mention some recommendations. So it's not exhaustive, it's only a few. These recommendations you can find in general in the SOMO reports. And yeah, one of the most important thing is always that companies should provide transparency about the origin of the materials, but also about the risks that they identify during the due diligence efforts and the steps taken to address them. So the latter is we do not find yet. Also, actually, the origin of materials, it is rare to find those. I would also mention when companies are using conflict minerals, of course, you have this compliance with the US and EU regulation. They are obliged to do this, but companies can do behave differently when it's about conflict minerals. Some companies say, okay, we just don't source conflict minerals, but actually in our recommendations we always said it's not okay that companies refrain from the tendency to avoid all risks. So we said use your leverage rather than opting out or leaving, and choose for constructive engagement and the enabling of responsible trade in high-risk areas. So I think also companies should be rewarded if they do more. Take proactive steps to make responsible sourcing possible. And also in this line, we also always recommend companies to engage in in-region projects that have the potential to directly improve the situation on the grounds. So are these examples of mica in India and gold in Uganda. So that are the projects or the steps company can take that have really impact on the ground, and not just to tick the boxes of the compulsory steps they have to take. Thank you for your attention, and Esther and I will wait for your questions later on.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you very much for this very great and overview and in-depth insights into what is already happening and where also the possible points are that we could be looking at. Especially, I'm looking from a perspective of Electronics Watch and the Make ICT Fair project, obviously. As you already mentioned before, we dive into questions that might have been already forwarded to Martina. We will first go to Liz, and Irene, could I ask you to stop sharing your screen? Okay, great. So Liz can now...
I'm going to be as quick as I can here because I think it's good to have time for discussion. Peter's already introduced who I am, and Irene has given a great introduction to this topic. So I'm just going to give an example of what we've started to do about conflict minerals at the University of Edinburgh as a public buyer. So this is the contents. I don't need to go through this. You'll see as we go through. I work in the Department for Social Responsibility and Sustainability. This slide will show you, if you want to consult afterwards, our strategic commitments to socially responsible procurement and human rights, and the areas that we work on within what we call SRS. And you'll see fair trade, procurement, supply chains is in there. And as Peter also mentioned, I manage a program of work in this area, which is a real collaboration between ourselves and the Procurement Office and others, and including lots of external actors as well. So why conflict minerals? Well, Irene has given good reasons as to why we should be doing something about this issue. This is one thing that we are working on as part of a much wider suite of projects to do with human rights and supply chains. But conflict minerals, there's been real sort of increasing understanding through research and campaigning and awareness of this issue and regulation. So what have we been doing about it? Well, since 2014, we started to develop a policy for the university on conflict minerals. This slide shows you a bit of the timeline, and the key thing to point out is that this has been a real collaboration between stakeholders within the university. So my department, the Procurement Office, our Students Association, and academics. We do have a number of academics at Edinburgh working on issues around mineral extraction in social and political science. So our policy was published in February 2016 and recently updated. So this slide shows you what our policy actually says. You can see the full version on the link at the bottom there on our website. So it's basically a public commitment to continuing to work collaboratively regarding conflict minerals and the risks in the goods the university buys. So of course we buy plenty of electronics in various different categories. We're working to get conflict minerals related questions into tenders, and also have this issue in contract management with our suppliers. We're also committed to awareness raising generally, so staff and student purchases as well, and to furthering our academic and student research and wider collaboration. There's a bit more wording than that in the actual policy, but that's a summary. I wanted to include a slide about communication because I was quite surprised actually about the amount of media focus there was when we announced that we had a policy on conflict minerals, which is, it's not a revolutionary policy, it's a commitment that we will do what we can on this issue, but as I'm sure you'll know, we can't just say, right, we're getting rid of any conflict minerals, or we're completely cleaning up our supply chains. It's nothing revolutionary, but still there was attention from BBC World Service, The Guardian, many different media outlets got in touch, and yeah, it won't all be accurate if you actually look online at some of the articles that were written, but I think it's great to have that amount of awareness raising just through announcing that we have a policy. And then this media attention did lead to some interest from suppliers. So not the big ICT companies that are already understanding this issue and taking some steps, but for example, some construction suppliers did ask us, oh, what does this mean for us in terms of our own electronics and minerals in our own supply chains? So that was good to see. And we had a student project. If you look on our website, this image here is a snapshot of our website, and there's different pages that you can look at there, which was developed with students. So as mentioned, we've recently updated our policy because the original version focused not solely, but quite heavily on ICT. And we want to be quite explicit that it's not just about ICT. There are electronics and circuit boards in so many different areas where there are minerals being used and where there is a risk of conflict minerals. So we've got 5 priority procurement categories: ICT, food and catering, laboratories, travel and estates. And we've extended our policy focus to show that there are minerals in construction, in vehicles, and electronics that you find in kitchens and catering as well. So what have we actually done so far? That link there you'll see at the top has a longer briefing for the higher education sector on progress to date regarding conflict minerals, which is on our website. But we have made sure that conflict minerals is a high risk through our procurement prioritisation process, where we use Scottish Government tools in each of these categories. So that means it's feeding through into our action plans for procurement. We've engaged with consortia and the wider sector. We have a meeting coming up with APUC very soon, specifically about conflict minerals and how we can further implement this policy. APUC is the Higher and Further Education Consortium for Scotland. And the Scottish Government does have questions in its invitation to tender and contract management. We're not going to claim that that's as a result of the policy, but hopefully there is influence. In November, we had an event for suppliers, which is going to become an annual thing. We focused on construction and food, but it will be for different categories in future. And we had about 50 supplier representatives, and conflict minerals was one of the issues that we discussed and explained the issue, the policy, and what suppliers can do and what good practice looks like. I'm just moving the box from the webinar from my slides. We have made sure that conflict minerals is embedded in the implementation plan of something we have called the Sustainable IT Group. So our IT staff are aware of this in their own purchasing. We have had student discussions about the policy in African studies, and thankfully they thought it was quite a good approach. And we have student research ongoing on conflict minerals and looking at our own suppliers as well. We've included this issue in staff sustainability training. And of course, we have events and different social media campaigns around Fair Trade Fortnight. So we've brought conflict minerals into that, and also into due diligence regarding our investment approach as a university. So next steps, Peter has already mentioned the Make ICT Fair project, the EU-funded project with 11 partners. We are a research partner on that. We plan much more engagement with suppliers, I've mentioned, through events, but also through case studies and student placements in suppliers. mentioned we're going to discuss further with APUC coming up, and APUC sustain a rollout of this database which asks suppliers questionnaires, and we have a full-time role working on that now in the university. And also linking to urban mining, which is something some academics at Edinburgh are working on regarding the circular economy and getting minerals out of discarded electronics. So of course we're looking for further collaboration with other universities and other organisations as well, because this is not something we can work on alone. It has to be a collaborative approach through consortia. I will leave it there, and hopefully we have a bit of time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for the presentation. And I hope, and I'm looking at the time, we definitely will have about 20 minutes of time for discussion. So in case you haven't yet had the time to write any questions to Martina, or as Karin did it to the entire group, please feel free, pose your questions, write them down, and Martina will be relaying them in the next minutes to the presenters. So I would think it makes sense for you, Martina, and for Esther, and leave, put on their audio, and I already hear you did. So Martina, it's your floor.
Sure, yeah. So I've put both Liz and Irene and Esther, they're all unmuted now, so we can have a nice discussion. We've had plenty of questions, so I'm going to work through them. I'll start with a question for Irene. How do we approach issues in the mining of minerals that are not termed conflict minerals, and what problems are there with these, associated with these?
Yes. So for the non-conflict minerals, I have an echo because Esther, can you
mute? Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah, I have a big echo. If you're looking at,
sorry, ik kan niet.
Yeah. Okay, now it's fine. Now it's fine. Sorry. If you're looking at for example, mica and gold that is mined in other countries, we are talking about the worst forms of child labor that are one of the major issues. But for instance, if we look at the platinum minerals that were mined in South Africa, the forced evictions from land and the land grabbing were the main issues. So people are forced from their lands, and no compensation is for those communities. So that is also one of the big issues in mining. And of course, the environmental degradation. If you look at the tin mining in Indonesia, the environmental issues are at the forefront. So there are lots of different issues besides labor rights violations, and it concerns all kinds of human rights violations. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, and so I'm going to move on to another question. Let's see. Okay, so we have one, thanks first of all, thanks for the many initiatives, programs and regulations presented. It would be nice to have an assessment on the pros and challenges on each of them. Do you have any advice on which ones are a must-have as compared to nice to have from a human rights perspective? Some sort of ranking?
No, we don't have a ranking on them. Also because the initiatives are very different from each other. Most of them are very specific on a country, or on a specific mine, maybe even, or getting, like in the case of tin, getting a specific tin out of the DSC towards supply chains of several ICT companies. So it would be quite difficult to rank them also. There's a difference between in-region initiatives and, for example, initiatives that are more about transparency, like the conflict minerals initiatives, in which we see there is not much being done on the ground. There are no programs in region, and also we don't see any change from these initiatives, and initiatives that are more focused on really on a specific region. So yeah, it would be quite hard to rank them, I'm afraid.
Right, okay. And so I'm going to move on. There are another couple of questions for you two. To what extent would urban mining reduce the pressure of mining conflict minerals?
It would certainly release the pressure, obviously, but we also see that not everything is getting back in urban mining. We see that, for example, especially small electronic devices, most of them are not coming back. So that means also that the minerals that are being used for them are not coming back into the urban mining system. So yes, it would certainly help, and much more should be done on that. But it's not alone; it's not enough. Also because, look at, for example, electronics like the battery. We see that cars are increasingly using minerals for electronics batteries, so the amount of minerals being used for that is increasing. So not everything can be used from urban mining because it's simply not enough.
Okay, thanks. And one more, and then we'll move on to some questions for Liz. And just so you all know, we will note down all these questions. If we don't get a chance to talk, to go through all of them, then we'll answer them via email afterwards. So one more question for you two. Do you know what it means in more detail that smelters are audited through RMI? What is the value? What is the critique?
The auditing is obviously on the smelter level. It's a lot about looking at risks. And so I would say the main critique is that I would say the good thing about it is that transparency is really helping a lot. The transparency of your supply chain, and also that you can see, I mean, are you actually using minerals from conflict affected areas? But what is not being done mostly is that the risks are being discussed. So if we look at reports about using conflict minerals, we don't see the risks that are discovered, for example, in the supply chain. So we don't see if companies really look down and really got information from the smelters on the risks in the mines associated with conflict areas and with conflict minerals. So what we see is that for transparency, yes, it's very good that these initiatives are there, but for change on the ground, that is, I would say, several steps further, and that is something I think that should follow now.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to ask Liz a couple of questions. Thank you for excellent presentations, Liz, and I'm curious on how you follow up on your contractual requirements. Are you using SAQs, third-party audits, etc.? Thank you.
Hi, yeah, so no, we don't have any third-party audits. We are only still in the process of actually putting in any requirements, because contracts, you know, the renewal schedule for contracts that last more than 4 years, we don't have contractual requirements in there for all of our ICT anyway, but where we do focus on this issue of conflict minerals, no, we don't have any third-party follow-up. Electronics Watch is the only third-party auditing that we have for work conditions in ICT factories, so there's a gap there. But what we are doing is what I mentioned very briefly with the APUC Sustain tool, which is a questionnaire developed by APUC and the wider sector here in Scotland, to ask suppliers to provide evidence of what they are doing to do with all sorts of social responsibility, sustainability aspects in their supply chains, and then that will be desk audited by trained colleagues. So it's not third-party auditing, but it's a collaboration across the sector that we are able to fund at the moment, but there's definitely a gap there.
Okay, and the next question is, could you elaborate at what stage the university incorporates conflict minerals issues, for example, contract performance clauses, award criteria, and how the verification and control is done? How did bidders react so far?
Yeah, so similar in terms of this is a journey that we're on, and we have not embedded all of these requirements yet, given the timeframes of contracts. I also know that I have several procurement colleagues from the university and the sector listening in here, because I'm not a procurement professional. So I'm involved in developing policy, doing research to feed into it and collaborating with procurement, but I'm not a procurement expert to be on the ground actually embedding these things and following up with them. So perhaps someone else wants to jump in there, or if not, we could follow up afterwards with procurement colleagues.
Okay, so I have another one, unless anyone else wants to say something more on this.
Does Mike Kilner not want to say something about what you do at the NDNA? Because in Edinburgh, we use the Scottish Government contracts. So as Liz has said, we try and influence them. But we use their contracts, but we also use some higher education frameworks. And maybe Mike would like to say something about how the suppliers have reacted to these things, if he's there.
Mike, let's see if I can...
He's maybe left us.
No, he doesn't seem to be there.
Can't see your mic on there.
He is here, just, let's see. No.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Mike.
No, Mike is here and I just unmuted him, but he seems to be unwilling to talk.
Which is an open plan office and listen in mode, he said in the chat.
Right, okay. Okay, so shall I move on then?
Yeah.
With the next question. So another one for Liz. Could you give us a flavour of your interaction with ICT companies on mining issues in your tender process? For example, what questions do you ask? What's the quality of response?
So again, I'm not the person that does the direct interaction. George, I don't know if you want to...
Well, as I've said, you know, the university doesn't ask the questions in its own tenders. For most of the ICT we purchase through frameworks. So the questions are asked by the framework owner. So Scottish Government or LUPC or SUPC. So probably better directing the questions to the individuals who have asked those questions, because we do it more as a contract management piece, and we ask the suppliers to give us the information. But we don't actually score it or use it in any tender evaluation yet. But that is kind of the direction of travel for the future, if we can persuade the consortia to take that on.
But I would say the contract management, we did, it wasn't me personally, but we did have questions to ICT suppliers across the board about this issue. And I was quite surprised about how responsive people were. They don't necessarily give you all the information that you would want, but there was quite good dialogue happening. And I don't know if that's the same across the board for public buyers or being a large institution. I'm not sure what standard to expect as a response, but there was dialogue on various sustainability issues with big ICT suppliers.
Yeah, they're quite happy to give us the information as long as it doesn't have any major contractual consequences for them, I guess. You know, so we haven't done any of the the measures that Electronics Watch have put in place for if suppliers don't supply particular information. We haven't gone to that kind of level. But yeah, the suppliers have been very helpful in this regard, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just working through all the questions because we've got quite a few still. Right. Could you talk in more detail about the oh no, sorry, hold on. Sorry. Okay, this one. How was the conflict minerals policy initially received among staff, and especially the procurement department at University of Edinburgh?
George is from our procurement department.
Yeah.
It's directly to both of you.
I mean, the policy itself is really just, as Liz said in the presentation, is just to raise the awareness. You know, we can't directly affect the framework agreements that we use. So it's not that it's not got any teeth, but it raises the awareness and lets the users know that these are the things that we're thinking about. So it just plants the seed in their head that these are things that are an issue.
And I think obviously we can affect frameworks if there's more than just us saying we want this issue in there. So that's the key point about collaboration.
Yeah.
Okay, and now I've got another couple for Irene and Esther. How about health and safety issues in the mines, like illnesses and accidents? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Those are rampant. I would say the health and safety issues are obviously, I mean, if you talk about mines, I mean, these are one of the most important issues to really deal with. And not alone, I would say, in the mines themselves, but also, for example, in the water. And you see an enormous environmental degradation, which also has the effects on the miners as well as on the population and the communities in the neighborhood. But if you, for example, look at the mining of gold, which is also done a lot through artisanal mining, you see, for example, the use of mercury by children. I mean, Irene and me, we've been to Uganda, to one of the artisanal mining sites where we saw small children using mercury, even transporting it, for example, in their mouth. And obviously, I mean, this has an enormous effect on the mines as well as on the environment. And yeah, I would say, I mean, talking about mining, child labor, health and safety issues, these are issues that should be dealt with immediately.
Okay, and then I'm going to go back to another one, which is, I think, for all of you. How do you balance the decarbonising of vehicles and offices? For example, electric vehicles, home store batteries, PV panels, etc., with mineral production and supply? How do we procure responsibly?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. How do you balance the decarbonising of vehicles and offices with mineral production and supply? How do we procure responsibly, or how can we procure responsibly?
I don't think, I mean, I'm the expert on this. Maybe somebody else who is here can answer this.
Yeah, I'm not either, but yeah, with great difficulty in terms of increasing demand for batteries, as mentioned, and how do we balance these different factors? It's a real challenge, and I'd like to see more research in this area so we could understand better the longer term picture. Don't really have an answer for that.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Okay. And I think we have time for just one more question. So, Sorry, I'm just realizing that some of them have already been answered. Okay, so another one to Irene and Esther. Could you mention could you talk about the limits of the initiatives that you presented? If that makes sense.
Well, some of the limits of the initiatives are is simply also because not enough companies are participating in these initiatives. So to like, for example, multi-stakeholder initiatives are really important to join, but you really need collaborations between companies and also cross-sectoral initiatives. If you're talking about MICA, it's important that you have not only the electronics industry on board, but also the automotive industry and the cosmetics industry. Once you have these collaborations, you can achieve something. So it is important that companies not only do what is compulsory, so the due diligence or according to the conflict mineral regulations, but to take extra steps. But you need, yeah, big collaborations.
Okay then, well, thank you very much, all of you, for the answers to the questions, and we will try and give answers to any questions that we haven't had time to answer afterwards over email. And as Peter said before, the recording and the slides will be available shortly. We'll send you the link for that. So Peter, back to you.
Yes, thank you all for first Irene and Liz for the presentations, but also for the really great discussions we had, and for Esther, you jumping in, and also George, you providing insights from the procurement side. So this was really very interesting. And as for me with mining, I'm still learning, so I took out very much from this webinar just for me, just in preparation, and I hope you also had some insightful moments. I just wanted to put out two things to you. Electronics Watch just released and published a policy brief on worker-driven transparency. So if you want to get some insights on how transparency could be also discussed, not from a risk perspective, but more from a worker and a resource perspective, please go on our webpage and read this very brief but very insightful document. And we already can announce our next webinar. It will be on May 29th, and it will deal with a very severe issue on working conditions and worker suicides in China. We are currently in the last moments of finishing a report on these issues, and it will be released, and we will have a very interesting webinar on this. So we'll be very happy if you join again. If you want to stay connected, write us an email and you will be put on the newsletter. Go to our webpage or follow us on Twitter. And with this, I would say again, thank you, and I hope you had a good time and you had some good insights. And I hope we can host you again for the next time and in our next webinar. Thanks.